Good evening. Rabbi Jacobson here. I welcome you all, as well as the internet audience, the ones that could see it. For another episode of Wednesday Night Live, titled Loving Eyes. The power of looking at someone. So, we open up this week's chapter, which is the beginning of a new book in the Torah called the Book of Numbers, or in Hebrew, the Book of Bamidbar. But the Book of Numbers is also an accurate name. Sefer Pekudim is what this book is called at times, because the literal reason for it is because both here in this chapter and a few chapters down, Pinchas in this book, in this fourth book of the 5 books of the Torah, there is a census held where God tells Moses to count the people, the Jewish people. And hence numbers, the numbers, counting them. In this chapter, as I said, again in Pinchas. And actually the Medrash says that there were 10 times, 9 times in history and 1/10 time that in the future, the Messianic age, that the Jewish people were counted. So the book is called the Book of Numbers for that purpose. The question is, what's the significance of the census? Why count? Does God not know how many people there are? Created them. God definitely knows. So what's the purpose of counting? So Rashi says, the classic commentary right in the opening of the chapter, Rashi says, "Miteichi basan lefanav meino isem kol shah." Because of the great affection, because of great love for the people, he counts them every hour. That's the literal translation. When they left Egypt, he counts them. When they fell due to the sin of the golden calf, he counted them. He counted them when the divine presence, the Shekhinah, began resting among them in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary. And as I said, there's a few other countings that happened later, for a total of 10 countings throughout history. And it's because of the great love. The question is, how does love have to do with counting? It's true that when you love the children, you go on a trip, or if you're a leader, you want to make sure they're all there, you keep counting them. Sign of care, make sure no one got lost. But there's something deeper than that, obviously, because in this case of God, as I say, he doesn't need to do that. He knows the number, he doesn't need to count them in the physical, literal sense. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, writes, he's a commentary as well that lived a little after Rashi. He writes that when you count someone, you have to see them. And the love is the looking at them. So the counting is not so much to know their number, because it's not like counting money or counting other material objects. It's the opportunity to see. And when you count, you have to see each one. So it's a form of expression of affection. And the key emphasis, therefore, is the look. And that will explain even why God, in a sense, counts. Not so much that God is afraid someone got lost, or knowing how many actual number there is for inventory purposes, but rather it's a sign of affection. And even on a divine level, on a cosmic level, there is also a need for affection, because as the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters say, when you talk about the divine, which is the distance between the divine and the mundane, is infinitely apart, like the difference between a creator and a creature. That one can argue that God doesn't care about us, and there's no common denominator between God and the human being. And in that sense, like many people who feel sad or feel at times forsaken, they will say, where's God? And I need him most. So the philosophical argument can be that God doesn't care. He's so far apart from us. Why would he care about us, small little creatures? And there's so many of us. So the idea is that God is telling Moses that, no, that's not the case. I do care, and that's why I count, because I want them to know that I'm there, and I will want to see them just as I want them to see me. And there's a power in that, as I said, the power of that type of love that's expressed through the eyes, actually seeing someone, which is manifest when you count them. I remember on a personal level, personal note, it was in 1992, actually 1991. The Hebrew year was Sukkot 5752, which was still the year 1990, like September, October 1991, which was really the new Hebrew year. And it was Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, the holiday. So, growing up where I grew up in Crown Heights, and as I've often cited my great teacher, the Rebbe, so I was coming to synagogue at Sukkot morning, and the custom was, for over all the years, was that the Rebbe would give one of his assistants his lulav and esrog to allow people to bless it. And there would be a line of people who would make a blessing on the lulav and esrog in the morning. Actually, the line would sometimes go for a few hours. But this time I came to synagogue, my fashionably late moment time, and I see there's some commotion going on. Welcome. What was the commotion? I got closer. The Rebbe was standing there and actually watching everybody pass by, make a blessing on his lulav and esrog. And he ended up standing from something like 8 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Talking about a 90-year-old man for 8 hours, basically, and just standing and looking in this most surreal way at every person that passed by. And no one really quite knew why. Unfortunately, a few months later, the Rebbe suffered a stroke, and then subsequently 2 years later passed away. And though we never got a clear explanation, but it's not uncommon that a leader, a teacher, a shepherd, as I said, the look is a sign of affection. And maybe this was a way of saying goodbye or a way of connecting. Because, as I just read from Rashi here, when you love someone, you count them all the time. And according to Nachmanides, the meaning is not the counting, it's the looking at. So how does Rashi say all the time when Rashi himself a moment later says that there are only several 10 counts? So obviously, it doesn't mean counting all the time, that every second you have to look. But when especially in times of crisis, especially in times of challenge, when you look at someone you love, that look lasts all the time. So the affection is expressed in times when you think that they're not there, or they anticipate some type of difficult moment. There's a look. And this is basically the essence of what real love is all about. And that's what I want to talk about. The love that we express to each other, and particularly, as I said, through loving eyes, the eyes of a person. They say that eyes are windows to the soul. So on one hand, you can say vision, and the visual is very superficial. The eyes seduce somebody. External looks, packaging. If something looks good, it can seduce somebody to falling for it, even though it can be dangerous or destructive. That's the power of eye, the power of the visual. You don't need any proof. You just look around today, how many billions of dollars are invested in marketing, in the packaging of something, far more than the product itself, the advertising of the product, that the image should look good. In many instances, it's only the image that's being sold, and there's nothing inside altogether. or very little. In some instances, it happens to be also a quality product, but will not be appreciated unless the packaging is in place. So on one hand, visual and the eyes can be seen as a very external and superficial force that distracts us, that seduces us, that deceives us even. On the other hand, we also see eyes have great power. A piercing look, a loving gaze. Eyes communicate a message even if you say nothing. Children at a very young age learn the language of the eyes because that's how they pick up what their parents are feeling. I tested this recently with my own granddaughter, certain rules that her mother made for her. So when her mother's out of the house, they were here for Passover, and she knows that rule is a strong rule. So she looks at me with her eyes to see how I'm going to react. And I saw you can't fool her, right away if I smile or a little anything or other. So eyes are a message that is deeper than words and deeper than many, many other things in life. And it almost has a combination of that both the superficial side as well as the depth. So according to the Kabbalists and Hasidic texts, it talks about eyes in the spiritual sense of the word. You have words like God saw or God appeared throughout the Torah. You have words of how the visual of something is expressed even on a spiritual level. The question is, what does it mean? So there's a halachic, there's a Jewish law that goes like this, that a witness cannot be a judge. Someone who witnessed an event or a crime cannot at the same time sit in judgment of that particular event. Why is that the case? Because once you see something with your eyes, you really cannot be objective. So if someone who witnessed a crime, a judge witness, he has to recuse himself from sitting in judgment. Whereas if you hear it from witnesses, or you listen to testimony and evidence is presented, you have the objectivity to weigh it all. That's the power of seeing something. So sight creates a certain truth. So in a spiritual sense, the power of vision, the power of sight, is really the power of connecting to something in a very real way. Now it's true, there are manipulative people, there are con artists, and there are those that can fool us. But, as I said, children, for example, or those that have discerning eye, you cannot fool. There are people who can see through a lot. Because the eyes, both the eyes that see can look into an eye of someone else and can tell a lot. You always see this if you fly in El Al to Israel. You don't have to go through 1,000 security guards, all of them not incompetent, don't know what they're doing. You have one young man or woman who just looks you straight in the eye, and like in 60 seconds, they more or less assess you. Because they're trained to see eye movement, they ask you questions, they see how you look. This requires training. But someone with a train can see a lot through the eyes of a person. So I don't know if they can train our American security departments. Here we have basically you ever go to these places, it's like a military compound. We have 40 people. And you wonder who's paying for their salaries. And then when it comes to love, as in the context of the Ramban, as he says that looking at something that God chooses, he wants to see, he wants to look, is a form of affection. They can see it. So you have the story at the end of the Bible, you have when Moses climbs up on the mountain. And this is after he prayed many prayers and asked God to allow him to go into the promised land. Remember, the whole story of the Torah is about getting into the promised land. Everything is about that, the whole journey to the promised land. And the end of the story, of all things, Moses and that entire generation, except for 2 people, never end up in the promised land. So we know that Moses asked 515 prayers, Veschanon, the Gematria of Veschanon, beseeching God to allow him to go into the promised land. And at the end of Moses' life, God says, you will not enter, but if you climb up on this mountain, I will allow you to see the promised land. And Moses does that. He goes up and he looks. It's one of the last verses in the Torah. And the question is asked, the most obvious question, and why Moses was not even disturbed by this. I mean, Moses was not interested in the sightseeing tour. He wasn't interested in going to the Promised Land to visit the graves and to eat some falafel. I don't know if there was falafel in those days, but you get the idea. He was interested in going to the Promised Land for spiritual reasons and the entry. So what kind of consolation is that for God telling him to go up on the mountain and look at it? What was he going to see exactly? So some of the commentaries answer and explain very powerfully that when a tzaddik, a holy person, looks at something, it changes the reality of that. Because vision is not just looking. As I said, sight can be very superficial, but if it's the eyes of the right person, those eyes can change even physical reality. And not necessarily in a miraculous way. There's something about the power of eyesight. And you can see it. Someone can look at you and you can have a physical reaction just from a look. You don't have to, even if they don't touch you or they don't say anything. If it's the right look from the right type of person in the right moment. And one of the commentaries, his name is Rabbi Yosef Rosen, that's known as the Ragachover Gaon, the great scholar from Ragachov who lived in the last century, early 20th century, writes that with Moses gazing on the land, it made it easier for the people to conquer it later when they would enter with Joshua and enter and fight their battles there. So Moses understood when God said to him, climb on the mountain and look at it, it wasn't some type of sightseeing experience. It had power. The power to see something and the power to affect. You have a similar story, not quite the same, but similar idea. You'll know where the cave of Rachel. Rachel, our matriarch, is buried in Beis Lechem, what they call Bethlehem. On the road, and the story is clearly told in the Bible. We also know that it's the road not far from there. You go a little further to the south. It's Hebron. Hebron, Marasa Machpelah, the grave site of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, and also Adam and Eve, that they're still fighting over till this day. So the story in the Bible, in the end of the book of Genesis, Parashat Vayechi, before Jacob passes away, he calls Joseph his son, his beloved son. Joseph and Benjamin were the only two children of Rachel, who died prematurely. And he tells Joseph the following words. He says to him, I'm soon going to pass away. I want you to promise me that you will take my body and not leave it here in Egypt and bury it together with my parents and grandparents in the Marasa Machpelah, in that double cave, Machpelah in Hebron. And then Jacob, anticipating and preempting what was the obvious question, he said to Joseph, and though I did not do the same courtesy to your own mother, because I did not bury her in the Marasa Machpelah, I buried her on the road. As it says, he buried her in the place, that's why Cave of Rachel, the Rachel's burying the place is literally on the road. Though I didn't give her the same courtesy I'm asking you to give me, it was not out of disrespect to her. On the contrary. And Jacob says, the famous verse he cites, Rachel mevak al baneha. A mother cries for her children. Your mother would have preferred to be on the road that when one day our grandchildren will be exiled after the destruction of the temples and they will be leaving Jerusalem, a mother wants to see her children when they are suffering. She doesn't want to be locked away somewhere. And she would have preferred that she be buried on the road that she would see them pass by. As opposed to the Hebron, the Marasa Machpelah, which was in a city away from that road. So the obvious question you could ask is what exactly, and of course Joseph complied. The obvious question is this. Rachel, once she's passed away, she's buried under the ground. What difference does it make if she's on the road or she's a few miles away from the road? She sees her children, she sees them from heaven. Yet there's something about physical proximity, which is why for Jews, gravesite was always considered to be a sacred ground. You could say the soul is gone, up back to the spiritual place. What value is there to the physical gravesite? And yet it's a sacred ground. The Morat HaMachpelah is sacred, because there's something about the monument, something about the physical presence that serves as a channel. And it's interesting, just as an aside, a footnote, our enemies make us wise. The first things anti-Semites always attacked when they came into a Jewish city were not the synagogues, were not the mikvot, were not the schools, were not the people's homes. It was the grave sites, the tombstones. They had some particular glee. The Nazis and before them the Cossacks, everybody had this particular pleasure to defile, to desecrate a graveyard. They would break the tombstones and desecrate it. And you have to think, why? What bothered them exactly? These people are dead. They're not their enemies any longer. Anyone's a threat is the people that are alive in the city. It's the synagogue. It's the place of worship, the place where Jews gather. Their secret hiding places. Why would they desecrate why did they feel that as a threat to them? People who already passed on. I'm not even getting into just the pain and refinement of a human being to leave those that are not here, to leave them be. There's always a certain etiquette that even enemies treat each other with that. I'm not getting into that. So they had hatred. It's because subconsciously they knew the power of the Jewish people is their connection to the previous generations. It's a memory. You say Yizkor. Yesterday was my father's yahrzeit. You say Kaddish. You never forget. And it's not just about holding on to some past. It's actually the power of eternity. Because it's our parents and grandparents that kept them going, was they knew that they would have children and grandchildren who would perpetuate the legacy. So it goes both ways. It's a chain. Those earlier parts of the chain knew that there are other links in the chain that would be coming. And the links that come, remember the links that came before. That's the connection. There is no present if there's no past. There's no future if there's no present and past. And in some unconscious way, subconscious way, our enemies recognize that. So they want to, and we, on the other hand, that's why we called it so sacred. Because in some way it is a connection. So even though a soul that has passed on may not be here physically, but we're told that a father or a mother and parents come to the wedding of their children. And the chuppah, some say 3 generations, some 4 generations. What does that mean? Aren't they there before? A soul is a soul. A soul can see everything on this earth. But in some way there's a more revealed presence between that spirit and this material world. And a parent carrying a loving child does not stop, the love does not stop upon death. We may not see the other side of the curtain, but that side can see us. And that's the point, that Rachel wanted to see her children. So there's a power of seeing something. And I could submit right now that to you, that the love that our mother or father gives us, I'm talking now in a healthy circumstance, the love is expressed more through the eyes in our early stages of our life than any other thing. Of course, a mother and a father can say words to the newborn child, can sing to them and cradle them, and all that has impact. I'm not denying it. But the first place that there's really a loving connection is when the mother's eyes meet the child's eyes. And you can look at it, and you can see. You may not know what's going on in the child's mind, but remember, that child will one day be someone like us. So if when we see things, it impacts us, you can imagine that a child sees something, it also impacts, and maybe even in a deeper way because it's so pure at that point. Today we look with we have shades. Even if you're not wearing shades, we all look with colored lenses, so to speak, everything, We're skeptical, we're cynical, we're jaded. Someone looks at you, you don't know, you're suspicious, you have your guard up until you let it down, and so on. So eyes are very powerful. Einayim is the way that the Torah calls it, einayim, eyes. And there are many verses that talk about the power of that eyesight. The ones I just cited here, I just wanted to emphasize how Moses looked at the land, Rachel looks at her children, even till this day, and it gives power. And definitely, the way we look at each other, we human beings who are here on earth, physical eyes looking at other physical eyes, also has power. I didn't research it, but they say that doves who are, a dove falls in love with another dove, it will never find a replacement ever again. Even if that other dove dies, it will never look for another dove. That's the power of dove's love. And you look at doves, their eyes, they make love with their eyes. There's some power that communicates from one dove to another. In Jewish Medrash, there's different discussions about this. And I didn't look up the scientific part of it, but we can leave that for the Circa committee to check out the stare and the look of doves, the gaze. But one thing is for sure, that in a pure environment, an innocent environment, the power that is expressed through the gaze of a person looking at another person with affection and with love has very powerful force. Which is why when Isaac first comes and meets Rebekah, it says Rebekah covered her eyes. She put her eyes down. Which is why we have the custom at a chuppah, at a wedding ceremony, it's called the badekin, that the groom puts a veil over the eyes of the bride. Now, why did she put her eyes down? It wasn't because she was embarrassed or ashamed or because Isaac in any way was threatening or because she was vulnerable. And eyes have a power. When you love somebody, you can see a lot in the eyes when they're vulnerable, when they want something. This type of discussion always has to, especially in the 21st century, has to be talked about with a lot of disclaimers because it also has many negative connotations. So that's why I said everything in here in a pure, innocent environment. And just because people have so-called contaminated the power of a loving gaze and so on, that doesn't mean it doesn't have very great potency. Like that philosopher that asked Rabbi Akiva, he said if God didn't want to have idolatry, he should have destroyed the sun and the moon, so there wouldn't be any sun worshippers or moon worshippers. To which Rabbi Akiva responded very simply, he says, because of the fools is God going to destroy his universe. Because there's some fools who think that the sun and the moon are there to be worshipped, that's why he's going to destroy them. So the Tosfos Yontif, the commentary, asked the question, there should have been a follow-up question, why didn't he destroy the fools? And the answer is because free will. You cannot take away the fools. So just because some people use eyesight or use the eyes and love in their own distorted or toxic ways, that doesn't mean that eyes are impure. Eyes are very pure. And as I said, that's why I kept referring to the children and so on. So there's a power of a gaze, there's a power of a connection that comes through eyes. I also think that science, and modern science, has not yet really fully discovered what is the power. Today we know there are sound waves, there are light waves. When you see something, what's really happening? Well, you're seeing the reflection of an object that is coming back to you through like a prism, which we have emulated and superficially created what's called the camera. So an eye looks at something, it's really picking up the airwaves and the light waves that are bouncing back from a particular object and quickly processing it, and you see an image. So that means there's something flowing, actually. No different than cellular phones. Even more so. These are all superficial and artificial technologies. This is natural. So when I look at you right now, you look at me, there's a flow of energy coming back and forth. We may not feel it because it's so subtle. And we are so, we live in a world where, only the things that are very loud and dominant. But the fact is that there's a power to a look that goes back and forth. And therefore, this going back to this chapter here, the story of God saying, I want to count them all the time, which really means looking at them, is a communication, an energy of affection. That's what the Ramban is saying. So it's not just about counting, as I said. It's not just even looking at something you like. It actually has an impact, as I pointed out with Moses, with Rachel, and so on. A look is not just a look, basically. Much more powerful than that. Now, all you need to do is ask a few men, when they see a beautiful woman walk by, even without any thoughts, what happens to them? I know this sounds a little sexist. What about a few women looking at a good-looking man? And for some reason, men are more stimulated by the visual. There's all kinds of theories about it. Some say for women, love is a noun, a state of being, and for men, it's a verb, it's an action. Men are more caught up in the physical, tangible identity of things, the moments. However you analyze it, I'm open to theories, especially coming from the women. If any of you have anything to say about this, I'd love to hear. Let's put it this way, it's still a work in progress to figure out why this is the way it is. But visual power is, it still impacts everybody, and it's very powerful. I remember I was once invited, more than once, to talk about this controversial topic called a mechitza. You all know what a mechitza is? A mechitza is called a partition, a wall, that Orthodox synagogues, you'll find a mechitza between the men and the women. And it's caused many controversies for many people because many say, I want to sit with my family by prayers, like I sit anywhere. Why separate the men and the women? Now, of course, it only gets much more exacerbated when you have the women sitting like cattle in a pen in some corner, so it doesn't really help the situation. And therefore many women are very feel offended by the whole concept. Now, there are synagogues that are beautiful synagogues where men and women are equally separate, but the concept has created a lot of controversy. What is this exactly? And I'm not here to talk about it, but I do remember talking about it once in public. And the question, it was at the end of my talk. This was a question that someone asked in the audience, and a guy yells out from the other end. He says, "I don't understand. Ask every man here. You sit in a synagogue and you see the women. There's no way you're praying in any kind." That's the bottom line. Unless they're all ugly, which synagogue can guarantee that. So we'll say that we'll only make a mechitza, And then, of course, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Who's going to determine that exactly? Right. And the interesting thing is women don't really feel the other way around. They don't feel distracted by the men that are there. So I wonder who's really the superior race, if you think about that. Who's in control here? Let's put it that way. We are wondering. Maybe that's the way God, in his mysterious ways, makes everyone think that they're the superior ones. The men think they wear the pants in the family. The women know that they tell the men which pants to wear. Or they suggest it in a suggestive way that the man doesn't even realize, and so on. So everybody gets what they think they're getting, and the battle of the sexes continues, and I guess it will never be fully resolved. I can't resist the famous classic joke of the guy who comes up to heaven, and there's the two lines there, and he's told that here's the line for all the men that were like the leaders in their homes, the powerful ones, the assertive ones, the secure and confident men, if there's such a thing. But there was that line. And then the second line was for what they call the henpecked. I know that's maybe offensive too, but for the men that were not exactly the bosses, their wives were. So he sees all the guys he knew that were like these chief executives that he thought were leaders, were like these type of, these assertive, macho type of guys, were all in that second line where, the wimps were supposed to be. And there's one little guy who's like a shriveled little old man who, like, scared of his own shadow, is standing in the line with the assertive ones. I didn't understand. So he goes over to this little guy and says, "What are you doing in this line?" So he's trembling. He says, "My wife told me to stand here." So in case you think you're assertive, you have to wonder who determined that too. Okay. So this is one for the women. I'm generally more pro-women than men, and maybe because I'm a man, so I know what men are about. But with no offense to any of the men here. And it's not the topic of the evening, so we won't go there. It's just somewhat of an aside about the power of the look. So going back to our theme here, which is the power of affection and love, there is unbelievable power in the way we look at each other. I would also suggest that we live in a world that we've become so callous that we're not that sensitive to it. We're not sensitive to it both in our own, using our eyes, and also how others, sensitive to when others look at us. There are times, obviously, when you're in danger or, God forbid, some other acute situation. So obviously, you're much more sensitive, the antenna are up to every eye movement. But like those Western films, where these guys are having these shootout, they focus on each of their eyes. The twitch of an eye, everything is very amplified. But in the common course of our days, we don't really put so much emphasis on it. But it's extremely powerful. And just to give equate it with something, it says that that animals will never attack a human being because they see the tzelem Elokim, they see the divine image on the face of that human being. And they know that a human being was created with a certain divine element. That's what it says in the holy books. So the question, of course, is asked, so why is it then we've seen, the fact is, that men have been attacked by, men and women have been attacked by wild animals? And the answer given is very interesting. It's because that person's divine image is concealed. He's not lived up to it. So the animal doesn't recognize the person as anything divine, just sees the person behave like an animal. So you're an animal just like me. That's why Daniel, in the lion's den, the lions did not touch him. It's always seen as a miracle. It's actually not seen as a miracle. It's actually because he was the way it was supposed to be. They respected it. And there are examples of it. You know, on YouTube you have today about how lions who have a certain allegiance to someone that brought them up. A lion is a natural predator. And yet, when it recognized someone that protected it or saved its life, we have clear evidence today that the lion suddenly loses all its natural anger. You know, you can see that. I don't know if you've seen those YouTube videos, a few of them. They're like amazing. I'm not suggesting that you can just trust that lion, and that will definitely not, but there's something. What does the lion see? It's not just it recognizes something, there's a connection that's made. So the fact that we are living in so this just demonstrates what kind of callous world we live. How much is our divine image concealed? Not. What would you look like if your divine image wasn't concealed? Well, a tzaddik can tell. When someone went to a tzaddik, I remember I was in Tzfat several years ago. I visit Tzfat. You've been to Tzfat, any of you? Northern Israel. Okay. It's its own mystical city there. It was the city where the Arizal, the holy Arizal, lived. Not for long, but he lived there and left his impact. And it was the capital of Kabbalah during that period of time. Some of the greatest Jewish leaders lived there, not just Kabbalists in general. So a guy came over to me. I don't know why he picked me out of everybody, but he came over to me and said to me, I want to tell you something, like a secret. And I met him at the old cemetery there. I saw that he was like a caretaker or something. So he comes over to me and says, I want to share with you something that I don't tell anyone, but this is, I live in Tzfat. My family is here 400 years. My father, my grandfather, great-grandfather, 400 years. And here's a story that I heard from my father, who told it to me in the name of his father, all the way back to the Arizal. So it's like a first source. He just shared it with me. I don't really know why. He said that Arizal would spend, this was known, that he would spend much of the week on the Canaries, which is the lake. The Canaries, what is it called? Yam Canaries, Canaries Sea of Galilee, they call it, right? But Canaries is the shape, because the sea is shaped like a harp. So it's called the Canaries. And he would spend most of the time throughout the week studying on a boat in the water. But he would come home for Shabbos. And when he would walk through the streets, and everyone knew that Friday morning, or whenever it was that he would come home, everyone in the streets would cover their faces. Because they knew that he could read a face. He could see a face. That's the story he told me. I mean, it was not just nothing very ultimately dramatic, but I was very touched by it. First, that he shared it with me, but also, that was what was passed on. The reason I was able to see. Because there is a power to see things, and the truth is people who are trained, who can see their own soul, can see your soul. So when you look at a face, we all see the same face physically. But the question is, how many layers can you see behind? How many, can you see how many layers of armor are you wearing right now? You don't even probably know. Because you get so used to it, you don't even know what's armor anymore and what's not. What would you look like if you took off all your armor? Some of us are terrified of the prospect because we don't want to be hurt. But all of us have layers, all of us have our masks and the faces we wear to adjust and to accommodate. I mean, just on a very basic level, you're not the same with people who are very close to you or in your own home than you are when you go out to a party, where you're officially in your best behavior. Some people that doesn't last long, but it's at least initially. That's your plan, to be in your best behavior. Because why? Because when you're meeting new people, not only do you want to impress, you're sensitive. You don't want to just let it all hang out, so to speak. And as I said, some people, it doesn't take long, especially with a drink or two. They say by a drunk, was is auf en lung is auf en zung. By a person who drank a little alcohol, whatever's on his lung is on his tongue. It's a Yiddish expression. You wear your heart in your sleeve, the way we put it. And essentially, things come out. But a person who's trained eyes can look at you and even quickly can assess pretty quickly what is going on, what's behind the surface and what's on the surface level. As I said, it's not always something that's even intentional. We build up armor based on our sensitivities. Some of the most sensitive people on earth have the greatest armor because they want to protect themselves. The porcupine, they say, has the softest underbelly, and therefore it has the sharpest needles. The sabra, Israelis like to compare themselves to a sabra, prickly on the outside, but very juicy and tender on the inside. So if you ever taste, I don't know if there are real sabras left anymore, they've defanged them all, but if a real sabra, like I remember experiencing when I was younger, I went to Israel and someone gave me a real one, the needles are so microscopic, they get stuck into all your fingers and you can't get rid of them like for a few years, like an abrasive Israeli, basically, on the outside. But then you open it up, it's very juicy and tender in the inside. So I guess that's how God made us. Finally, the pearl, natural pearls. Where do natural pearls come from? They come from an oyster, an irritated oyster, basically. Let's put it this way. The pearl is the product of an irritated oyster. An oyster has very sensitive skin under the shell, very sensitive, and almost like an eyeball. And when a piece of dust gets stuck in there, the oyster will do is secrete this oozing fluid that when it hardens, it's a pearl. It's basically to protect it from the dust is so irritating. So when we have, let's say, a piece of dust on your eye, usually the tear ducts, the eye washes itself out, gets rid of the dust. But an oyster has that trick. And all those pearls you find in an oyster are basically all product of irritation, which we consider to be such a prized, valued thing. So next time you wear pearls, just remember, someone else's irritation has become your luxury, okay? And or someone who loves you says, here's a new set of string of pearls. You'll say, instead of telling you there was a bunch of oysters that were very, very agitated, and that's what I brought you to wear around your neck. To remind you, for the next time I agitate you, this will be a compensation. I don't know if that's what people think about, but diamonds. So De Beers made a great marketing thing. Diamonds are forever. Diamonds are created through unbelievable intense pressure under the ground that no one could survive such pressure. But that's what becomes valuable. Anyway, that's the social commentary part. But to go back to this discussion here is that the power of our eyes and the power of other eyes that set themselves on us is underestimated, greatly underestimated. And it is because very often we live in a world that is, as I said, a very dangerous world, a lot of predators. So we don't want to be vulnerable in the way we look at people. We call a poker face, right? You can't tell anything on the eyes of a good poker player, whether they're happy or not, or so on. And so it's become like a gift. People think it's an art, that you conceal your feelings. And I would agree, it is an art in a world of predators. But if you lived in a pure world, it actually would be a detriment if someone couldn't read your face. Because in pure people, you want to be able to communicate honestly and transparently. So in a world before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, they were naked, physically naked. Because they did not need garments and they were not conscious of their sexuality. And naked was not a negative word. It wasn't associated with anything inappropriate. A newborn child is also naked. And sexuality is very much part of who we are, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. What happens when we become conscious of it? When we become conscious of our thoughts about sexuality, other people's thoughts. How sexuality is so like a snowballed element that has selfishness in it and has love in it, and it's like we don't know whether it's good or it's bad, or both together. And all the guilt associated over the years and centuries, especially coming from religion. And I say that very deliberately because Christianity created a certain element that sexuality is a type of necessary evil. And that's why the people who are supposed to be people of the cloth are celibate, which essentially suggests that sexuality is not for the purists. You tolerate it. Now, we're not getting into that celibacy and how actual it is and reality it is. That's another story. And we're also not discussing the fact that before the 6th century, Christianity did not have any celibacy among the priests. It was really a real estate issue, and I'm not exaggerating, you can check that out, because the families and children of the priests wanted to inherit the churches, so they decided and determined, you know what, let's get rid of the issue of having children, and if anyone claims that there's a child, you say, no, the priest is too pure to have children, and that way they don't have an issue of anyone inheriting or being an heir to the real estate empire. I know it sounds ridiculous, but check it out. I'm not exaggerating. But to go back to the Jewish perspective on sexuality, on the other hand, has nothing to do with anything evil at all. It is God, the good God, that created you and your mind and your heart and your body and your sexuality, and then that's that. As Nachmanides writes, the same Nachmanides I quoted earlier about the look and the affection, that he writes a letter. He writes that it's a gross mistake to say that sexuality is associated with something that is a dover maguna, which means something to be ashamed of, something ugly, something despicable, something negative. But very much our education is fraught with this message that sexuality, something's wrong with it. You have to hide it. You have to be ashamed. Guilt, neurosis, all that's related to it. I'm not suggesting sexuality cannot be abused. Obviously, it can be seriously abused, and when in any abuse on the sexual level is much deeper than any other type of abuse, because it does get into the kishkis, so to speak, the soul of who you are, the essence of who you are. If someone just scratches your finger, it's an external scratch. Someone scratches your sexuality, so to speak, is a deep wound, because it's so much part of who we are and our soul. So anything that's, like I said, with the oyster or with the porcupine, anything that is extremely gentle, extremely tender and sensitive, can be seriously hurt. But that's not to be confused with sexuality being a bad thing. It just means sexuality is our most vulnerable part of who we are. And as such, it needs to be protected in a world of predators and a world of narcissism and so on. But at the same time, we shouldn't be throwing out the baby in the bathwater. As I said earlier, we don't destroy the sun or the moon just because it's abused. There is a power to sight, to be able to look. So how does that play itself out in our lives? And what do we learn from this? We learned this week's chapter that God looked at the people, and he wanted to look at them, and that was what the count was all about. And in a way, he also forced, not against their will, but he also, in effect, also forced Moses and Aaron and all those who led the census to also look at each other, which is essentially the source of v'ahavta kamocha. When you have to look at people and count them, because God told them, there's a certain affection involved, because it means each one counts. No one is more than one, no one is less than one. And the wealthiest and the most privileged are the same number one unit as the person who's impoverished and maybe seen as less accomplished. So the fact that you had to go and count, really, as according to the Rambam, was not just counting, it was affection. It was showing the value. So in every family you'll have several children of siblings, and always have people who never have children always ask, do you really love all your children equally? Or how much love can you pass around, I have a sister-in-law who has 17 children. Why don't you say Ken Yirbu? Yeah, she'll need a miracle for that, but... and people always ask, you love them all the same? Now, anyone that knows love is not quantitative, it's qualitative. My grandmother would say, my grandmother had 9 children. My mother is the oldest of 9. She would always say it's like the sun reflected in drops of water. The same sun. It doesn't matter how big the drop and how many drops there are. One sun can heat up a world of 6 billion people. One sun is reflected in the biggest ocean as much as is reflected in one drop. So love is not one of those quantitative things that you run out of it, exactly. It's a qualitative thing, and each child has love differently. From healthy parents, it's different. And not different in this type of, patronizing way, equal but different but equal. But different because different children require different things. If one child has more needs for whatever reason, and a parent gives more attention to that child because of those needs, in a healthy situation, that's not because there's any favoritism. Again, I should qualify, this doesn't mean parents don't play favoritism and that we don't have plenty of problems in families. I'm talking obviously the healthy sort. So there's a power to that love, and when a child, when a parent without even saying anything, looks at their child, and hopefully also the other way around, and looks at all their children sitting together, there's a power just to look. There's a look. So when God counts the people and tells Moses to count them, and tells whoever right senses, it was creating affection and love. So what does it teach us about ourselves? Well, first of all, we don't live in a world where this is even appreciated. When's the last time someone called you and they said, I just want to meet you and just to look at you? You know? And for no ulterior motives or underhanded motives. You know, we don't live in such a world. If someone called you, you'd be very suspicious. You know? What? No one's ever called you, Deborah? Okay. Well, you see, just the idea that I brought up is so weird, right? You think the person is weird. Now, I understand an intelligent person is not going to call up and say that exactly. They'll find some other excuse. They say, why don't we go for a coffee? So maybe you have to think, maybe they just want to look at you. How do you like that? My point is, I said it intentionally because to show how, for us, it's ludicrous, the concept. But in truth, it's really the way it was meant to be. You wouldn't laugh if I said the same thing, a mother calling up, let's say a mother who's been traveling and says, I want to put my child on Skype, I want to see that child. No one would laugh for that. Or if you traveled for a long time and you just come back and see somebody that you loved, and you just say, I just want to see you, even without having to discuss anything. Because we understand those environments as pure, but they're just not so common. And we live in a world that is deeply, deeply contaminated. That even saying things like this, sound weird. So I'm not suggesting we can change it all overnight, but I will suggest this, that it's a very healthy, fresh air to introduce into your life some people that you could have a relationship like that with. And I don't mean this necessarily only in a romantic or sexual way. Obviously, God should bless everyone to find their soulmate where you can stare at each other forever without saying anything and not feel awkward. But I'm even talking about it in a pure way. They're friends that doesn't have to be necessarily romantic. I know it can seem weird, two people just staring at each other. I'm not talking about that. A look can be also a fleeting look. That look. You're ever in a big group of people and there's something going on and you're both like a knowing look and you look at someone and say, what the hell is going, That look is also meaningful. I remember in the early days of this class, it was an unspoken rule, but it was like the idea that you'd be walking down Fifth Avenue in the middle of the rush hour, you see like 1 million people. And people, imagine you can just like look at somebody and they both get it, even though there's so many people around. It's the idea of being able to bond and connect in deeper ways. And obviously, above all, I'm just saying that in the general sense of the word, above all, it does apply, obviously, in a romantic sense, because even though this census here wasn't necessarily romantic in the technical sense of the word, but when God looks at the people, it's connected to love, to real love. And therefore, that also applies to our own ability to communicate in that fashion. So it's a language that I guess has to be learned, or has to be harnessed, maybe is the better word. It's a language that can help us understand each other in a deeper way. And then I go back to what I said earlier about that tzaddik, the person who can look at you and see, and you can look at them and see. In a very pure way, without any other thing. Here we're not talking at all necessarily love or affection in any romantic or sexual sense of it, or intimate sense. It's just the ability to see beyond the layers and layers. Michelangelo said, as I've recently been citing, this was a compliment given to me a few years ago before Rosh Hashanah. I got a note from a woman who was getting the weekly emails that I was sending. And she wrote to me she had a very difficult year, but she wanted to thank me at the end of the Hebrew year. A very difficult year. She went through a very ugly divorce, I think Austin, Texas. And now she's writing from Seattle. She ended up in Seattle. And she said that it was a tough year, but I'll tell you, your emails, the weekly emails, really kept me going. And I would look forward all week just to get them. Interesting, like a life raft type of thing. And then she said, finally, she says, I'd like to tell you, she was a sculptor in her profession. I'd like to quote Michelangelo. Michelangelo was once asked, how does he sculpt these beautiful angels? And the answer was given. He answered, he says, I saw. Shalom, shalom. Perfect timing. Perfect timing, sag ich. So Michelangelo was asked, how do you see these beautiful angels? I'm sorry, how do you sculpt these beautiful angels and these beautiful sculptures? And he answered, an unbelievable answer. You think about it. He said, I see the angel trapped in the marble. I see the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. And this woman wrote to me in the note, she says, so thank you for setting my angel free. So what is a sculptor? What is an artist? What is a talent like that able to see that we can't see? And the truth is, each of us here in this room have something that you can see that others can't see. It may be just your innate skill you were born with, or through training and experience, or a combination of both. Everybody can see something that others cannot see. So what is it that Michelangelo was able to see? And it's interesting, his name is Michelangelo, the angel Michael, which is the angel of Israel. So what did he see? What a trained eye can see is they'd be able to see beyond the trappings, beyond the layers, and they see the purity in something. So that's really what we're talking about here. This goes much deeper than just what I was talking, the romantic or the intimate. Because really what love is really, it's not about getting something from another person. It's about seeing the person like no other person sees them. Two people who really love each other, see something in each other no one else can see. And you will show something, you will show the person that you're beloved, you will show a part of yourself that you will not show others. And they will see a part of you that you may not even want to show. So all of us have that essential part, and there's the layers that gather and collect, the layers of dust. On the Torah you have the concept, you have what's called esis achkika and esis aksiva. In Hebrew that means engraved letters and written letters. When Moses received the Ten Commandments, the tablets, which we'll celebrate shortly, Shavuot, and the holiday in a week, 2 weeks. When Moses received he received them as engraved letters, and 2 tablets that God himself engraved and carved. And then there's the Sefer Torah. At the end of the Torah it says that Moses wrote the Torah scrolls. So in explaining the distinction between these two, what's the difference between a Torah scroll and the luches, the engraved letters, and why do you need both? As a matter of fact, inside of the ark, the Holy Ark, you had both. You had the Torah scroll, the ones that Moses wrote. He wrote 13 Torah scrolls and one was placed in the ark. And you had also the luches, the tablets. Why both? And also the broken tablets, just for the record. So it's explained because there's a distinction between engraved letters and written letters. What's the distinction? Very clear. When you write, you take ink and put it to paper or parchment. These are 2 distinct entities that are combined. So it's true, once it's written into the parchment, it's somewhat connected to the parchment. But in a way you could also erase it. It may be hard to erase. But it's still 2 elements. It's the ink darkens that part of the area. When you engrave letters in stone, the engraving is from the stone itself. Nothing is being added. You're actually taking the stone and carving it and taking something and leaving the engraved letters in there. So there's no way you can eliminate those letters because they're part of the stone itself. So the way Hasidic teaching is explaining that we have 2 experiences in life. We have things that are added on and really not part of who you are, and there are things that are engraved inside of you through and through. So in psychological terms, if you ask the question, are we good people or are we selfish people? So Freud concluded, based I guess on observing himself in the mirror and projection, that we are essentially the ID, is essentially a selfish narcissistic force, only interested in your own survival. That's the engraving part. And goodness, being kind, especially if you add a social Darwinian element to it, Being kind is part of the selfishness, because the way to survive is by being helpful to others, they're helpful to you. In other words, it's all part of your own needs. In Jewish philosophy, even though Freud was Jewish, but he had issues with Moses, as those that have the books of Moses. If he actually had met Moses, Moses would have taught him a thing or two, that in Jewish thought, a person is fundamentally engraved a good person. So Freud was half right. There is a fundamental essence of a human nature, except it's not the id, it's the yid. Okay? Yeah, the yud. The pintel yud, the pintel of the spark. So if he had dug a little deeper, he would have met something different. That doesn't mean we can't be narcissistic and we can't be selfish, but it means if you dig deeper, essentially what's engraved in our soul, not add-on, not acquired, and not taught. What you are essentially is an angel, or even better, a divine image. B'tselem Elokim. God created each person in the divine image. As I said earlier, but the divine image, then dust has gathered. Now this is not a small difference. You could say, well, if once the dust is gathered, who really cares if it's engraved or not engraved? Major difference, because one is just revealing something that's there, the other is having to build it in. And we all know, if it's not natural, something that's acquired, opposed to something that's natural and inherent, acquired will never be able to match up to something that's natural. You know, the classic martial analogy they give for it is these two philosophers are arguing, you know, whether you can train animals to be like humans. And one of them was working on experiments where he was training cats to be humans. And the way he did it was he was training them to be waiters in restaurants. So he dressed them up in tails. I don't mean cat tails, coat tails. And tuxedos and bow ties and the works. And they would deliver food to the guests. And the philosopher so proudly shows the other philosophers who's skeptical and says, look, here, I trained a cat, no longer walks on all four, he walks on two. He's dressed, you know, and looks like an elegant gentleman or gentlewoman, and he is serving the meals just as any good waiter would do. The other philosopher decided, okay, let's go out to dinner again. This time he came with a little bag, and he didn't tell the other guy what's in the bag. In the bag were a bunch of little mice. And right when the entree was being served, and the cat is so walking with his head up in the air, looking so beautiful and elegant and so on, he opens his little bag, and the mice start running. And what do you think happens? The cat, with his tails, with everything, drops the food, drops the tray, and goes chasing the little mice. In other words, yeah, you can train people to do many tricks, but something acquired can never match up to something that's natural. So if goodness and kindness is acquired through education, but our natural state is the id that is selfish, no way that the goodness will prevail. But according to Jewish thought, we created B'tselem Elokim. You are fundamentally engraved within you is a certain divine dimension. You're a divine entity. And the dust, and who cares how many layers have gathered, can never destroy the engraved letters within your soul. And you need a trained person who can look. And the look, like Michelangelo, literally can pierce through the layers. And first of all, see what you're capable of. And in a way, the look could also melt away some of those layers. But obviously, you have to do some of the work yourself. That's somewhat what Moses did when he looked at the promised land from the mountain. His look was able to pierce, was able to get rid of some of the layers, which would make it easier. That's what the power of a look is, especially the look of a tzaddik. So, in context of our lives, basically, it would be good to have someone in your life that can look at you that way, but also how you look at yourself. And I think I mentioned here last year, someone sent me an email with an attachment. And the attachment was a baby picture. And she writes to me, this is what I look like as a baby. What happened? How did I get from there to here? I can't even recognize myself. And I remember it struck me, it was like a very interesting thing, and I thought it may be a good exercise. I don't know if right now, but definitely a Rosh Hashanah exercise, Yom Kippur exercise, but it could be any time. You know, to retrace the steps. That's who you are, and here's who you are now. It's the same person, but a lot has happened. You know, a lot of wounds, experiences, pains. But Jewish thought fundamentally is that there's no such thing as lost or hopeless, that you can always connect to that place. And that is also what ultimately the real power of a look. Someone that loves you sees you for who you are, not for who you think you are, or not for all the layers that you project. I know they say that when Nixon, the night that he resigned due to Watergate, so as he was walking out of the presidential quarters, he was with Kissinger, and Kissinger writes in his memoirs that Nixon stopped at the big picture there in the White House of John F. Kennedy, JFK. There's a big picture of him, like a contemplative picture, where his head is down with his... and this is what Kissinger recounts, is that Nixon said quietly, he said, they love you because you remind them of who they want to be. And they hate me because I remind them of who they are. That's what Nixon said. Now, if he said it's a pretty wise statement. You know, a good friend, a real good friend, a true friend, and maybe this is a definition of a friend you've not heard before, is not just someone who's there to support you or help you. That goes without saying. Someone who cares. But it's also someone who sees you for who you really are. And you're comfortable with that. For who you are beneath the surface or beyond all those layers. You know, the ability to see something that does not necessarily project itself. And as I said earlier, all of us have the capacity to see certain things. Sometimes it's due to our difficult life experiences, sometimes it's due to our beautiful life experiences. So number one, I think one lesson from this whole story episode that we're talking about, the look, and Ramban writes, Nachmanides writes about the look of seeing, that why God, Hashem, counts because he wants to see them. It's a sign of affection. One lesson is that to exercise that power, to see others, to see situations for what they really are, and not for what they seem to be, appear. Because that itself helps. If someone is in need, or someone's in a situation, and you, who are trained, or whatever reason you have that sensitivity, you can help someone see something not the way they would see it. That helps cut through the clutter and the smoke screens and so on. You know, for me, I always find that one of the key things in helping people is not necessarily something you can give them, a magic pill or even a piece of advice. It's much deeper than that. It's helping them distinguish between the symptoms and the root. That's very hard for a person to see on their own. Because when you lived with symptoms for long enough, you think the symptoms are the problem, when they're only the expression of it. To be able to help somebody get through the smoke screens of ego, vanity, pride, or just plain blind spots, which we all have, and just be that objective person that doesn't get deceived or distracted by people's games. You know, we all have games. As I said, the oyster, it's got plenty of layers that he rolls on that become pearls. And we've got our own pearls. You know, people have machinations. You know, I've seen pretty interesting ones. The extent that people will go, the extremes they'll go to cover up their tracks, to cover their tracks. And what's even more bizarre is not that it's unintentional. It's like almost an instinctive reaction to protect yourself. You do all kinds of things. I'm not even talking about just lying or deception and so on. So the ability to see and help others who can use your so-called discerning eye is a gift. And it's something we should try to find people that we can help in that way. And then vice versa, allowing others in to be able to help us that way. Because that ultimately is the real root of love and affection. It's not just, as I said, purely people like each other. It's the ability to really care about somebody, to help them actualize their potential. Because after all, what greater gift can you give somebody than help them actualize what they're capable of? That may be trapped under layers and layers and layers, as Michelangelo said, of marble, concrete. I'm not going to get into all the other substances that exist that things can be buried under. But layers and layers. And find those, that's called fossil fuels that lie within your soul, your potential. Because think of the tragedy the other way around. You can live your life, and you were blessed with certain gifts and certain potential, and simply due to life circumstances, fears, whatever armor that you built up, Remember, armor works both ways. Nothing can get in, but nothing can get out either. As a result, unbelievable potential, something you have to contribute to this world that only you can contribute, remains trapped. All this is what the power of sight, power of looking can do, is the power to see, really see, to see what lies within, what lies beneath, and so on. And we can all help each other in this way. And this is a lesson. So it's not just about counting as a census. The U.S. census every 10 years, whatever, how long. They take a census in order to allocate resources, taxation, representation, the whole works. That's on a very technical level, those census. But in the Torah's context of census, the minyanim, 10 times that the Jewish people were counted, with 9 having happened already and the 10th to come when Mashiach, in the Messianic age when Mashiach comes, is the power of cutting through the layers of existence and seeing a person from where they are. And that's why everybody's only one. When you count, there's no such thing as one person being counted as 2. No matter how wealthy, no matter how powerful, Moses was 1. Aaron is 1. And the simplest are 1. Because when it comes to the value, the pure inherent worth of a human being, externals make no difference. Al tabit al merehu. We don't look at the outside. Obviously, in Jewish thought, the goal is to bring the inside out. Michelangelo's art wasn't just that he was able to see the angels, but he was able to carve away the right way that the angels emerged. So it's not just about knowing or believing or seeing, but it's also about doing something about it, and actualizing it. But it begins, first of all, in believing it, And this is a tremendous lesson, especially if you think in terms of therapy or education or all healing. Because if you don't believe in the infinite potential or in the healing potential and the resilience of a soul, a person can make the argument, hey, too late for me. I'm damaged goods. I've been hurt. That's it. And everybody's gone through that experience where you've really suffered something, especially the day after. You don't think you're ever going to make it again. You give it up. That's why it's so critical. That first thing is to know that's not correct. Your assessment, number one, is subjective, especially when you're coming from the shadow of pain. And you have to realize that there's something inside of you may not see. That's why you need someone to look at you and say, it's not correct. I see something that you don't see. And you'll kick and scream. I've had this many times. People tell me, don't tell me, the darkness I've experienced, nobody has ever experienced. And I will never get out of it. And I always say, look, you can be as obstinate as you like, but we'll see who wins, I'm not saying the darkness won't win if you insist, but there's also another voice, that maybe there's something inside of you that you don't even know you have. And it's strange that you have to argue with someone to tell them that they have a good side, and they're trying to tell you that they don't. It's usually the other way around, right? But that's what it is, because subjectivity creates that. And I'll tell you something else. People are afraid to know they have such potential. You know why? Because then you're responsible to actualize it. Sometimes nicer to say, I'm not capable, and that's it. That way you can't fail. Because you weren't capable, you're not going to run the marathon, you don't think you can win it. But if you suddenly convinces you that really you have it in you, then becomes the whole thing. Number one is, why am I not doing it? Number two, maybe I will fail, all those fears. And trust me, all of us have these challenges, everybody. Because we live in a world where there is a dichotomy, a dissonance between who we are and who we really are and what we project. As I said last week, if you ask people, who are you? They usually give you their business card. That's the best of all. That takes care. That's the armor of all armor, a business card, and that's it. Don't ask any more questions. And then you start saying, well, 1 second. That's what you do. That's your job. I meant to say, who are you? So that becomes a little more sensitive. Some of us have developed an elevator pitch for that too. I've even had situations where somebody just tells you in 10 seconds all the abuse they've endured, and they think it's over. Because now, they've even got the courage to tell you how hurt they've been. So, welcome. So, the idea to believe in somebody that they're capable of something is not so easy. Sometimes easier to say. That's why one of the Rebbes, Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, said to someone, and also writes about this, just like you have to know your own faults, you have to also know your own strengths. Why would he have to say that? We all have egos. Most people know more their strengths than their negatives, because it's not so simple. I discovered that sometimes it's harder to acknowledge your strengths than your weaknesses, because if you acknowledge your strengths, then you can also be held responsible and accountable. Are you living up to them? So it's always easier to be a little more humble, even though your ego is intact, but we don't want to fail. You don't want to hear that you can run a marathon, then find out you never did it because you didn't have the confidence. He's actually father-in-law of my sister. His name is Rabbi Hecht, Avram Hecht. So when he was a student in the yeshiva, the same Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, told him that he should go out. He was encouraging students to go out to different communities and speak and teach. And he was this teenager, and he says to the Rebbe, listen, that's not for me. My older brother's a good speaker, but this one's a this. And the Rebbe looked at him sharply, with sharp eyes, talking about a look, and said to him, he said in Hebrew, Yiddish, and I'll translate it, he said, what was the expression? He said, Anova shalebim kema, you say dase gaiva, which means misplaced humility is rooted in arrogance. In other words, he didn't tell him, you're telling me you can't speak. What do you think? Suddenly you don't, everyone has their skills. It's because you don't want to fail. You're afraid of trying something new, because then maybe you may not succeed. So you just say, I can't do it, and that's it. Now, I'm not suggesting we have to take upon ourselves everything in the world. There are definitely skills that we may not have. That's why, however, you have to have an objective party. It says in the Talmud, just like you can't bear witness on yourself and call yourself a Rasha, you also can't call yourself a tzaddik. Just like you can't say you're a tzaddik, you're a great person, you also can't say you're a bad person. You're too subjective about that. That's why we need that objectivity. So the concept that I'm describing here, going back to summing up this message, Nachmanides, Ramban says in this parsha, this chapter, that what was the idea of the census, of counting the Jews, each one? It was not just about, as Rashi says, that out of love you count. Why is counting connected to love? And does God really need to count? He knows the number. As Ramban adds, it's not the counting, it's the affection. And when you count, you have to look at the person you're counting. And when you look, when you love something, you look at it, it brings out that affection. Affection wants to look at what it likes and what it loves. And therefore, this counting was, and as I said further, not just the look, it's not just the pleasure of looking at something you love, but it actually has an impact. Because when you have to look at someone and look at them the real way, you see what their value is. When God looks at somebody, he doesn't look at their externals. He looks at their value, their beauty, why he put them on earth. So what I was saying was, it's good to have in life people who see you for who you really are. We have plenty of people who remind you how bad you are. Every time you get enthusiastic, I'm sure you can find enough people to call, and they'll tell you, don't get so enthusiastic, don't get so excited, But how many people can you call that will tell you, yes, you're right, you're able to do anything? How many people can you put down on a piece of paper right now that give you the confidence that you can accomplish anything? We don't live in a world that people do that. First of all, people like to see others fail because it makes you feel better, because that way you're not so bad, I fail, you fail, we all fail. There's such a thing. Then there's a thing called, in Yiddish, nicht verginnen, in German the word is schadenfreude. It doesn't matter. Even if someone has gain, but you just don't want someone else to gain. I guess the only psychological reason is what I just said, because someone else gains, it reflects that you may not have everything. Then there's the other side, and that's what the parsha teaches us. How to look at somebody. As Michelangelo said, I see the angel trapped in the marble, I carved and set her free. Find a friend like that. That's a friend. A person who sees your potential, believes in it, and more importantly, gives you the confidence to carve and let it come through. Because there's no question that we live in a world where we have the dichotomy of who we really are and what we live on the surface. We have all the layers of armor, the dust, all the concrete, all the things that soul is trapped in. When a chassid went, for example, to see a rebbe, it's called yechidus. Yechidus means literally private audience. But yechidus also means, the deeper word in Hebrew, that in the soul there are 5 levels. There's nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida. I discussed this many times here. 5 dimensions to the soul. I know usually you hear only about one soul, But like they say about the Eskimos, they say they have 70 names for snow. Because they live among the snow all day, so they have every type of snow has another name. By us, one snowfall, so all it is snow. Well, for Jews, because they're supposed to be accustomed to the soul, we have a lot of names for the soul, because the soul, there are different souls. And there are different dimensions of the soul. So briefly, the outer level of the soul, when we say someone is alive, biological life is called nefesh. But you can be biologically alive, God forbid, and be a zombie, be in a coma, God forbid. You could even be walking around but feel like you're dead. So there's another level of neshama, nefesh, comes ruach, spirit, which is emotional life. Then you have a third dimension that's called neshama. That's intellectual life. You know, you could have the biological, you could have the emotional, but you're not thinking, you're not conceiving of ideas. Then there's the fourth level, it's spiritual life, a transcendental type of life. But then there's the fifth level, which is called yechida. Yechida means oneness, unity. And we use it's an expression we say in the Haishain, it's yechida liyardecha. So it's the deepest part of the soul where you're connected to the essence of your soul. So Jews pray every day 3 times, Shabbos and holidays 4 times, and on Yom Kippur once a year 5. So what it says is that because on every day we're able to access the first 3 dimensions of the soul. On Shabbos and holidays we can dimension through the Musaf, through the 4th prayer, we reach the transcendental. Now, on the weekday, you're busy at work mostly, even though you pray, but you can't reach the deepest level. Shabbos and holidays, we reach the 4th, so there's a 4th prayer. And Yom Kippur, we add the Ne'ilah, the 5th prayer, where you can reach the essence of the soul once a year. So it's always there, but it's concealed. So it says that when a chassid went into a Rebbe, it was yechida, yechidus. It was yechida meeting yechida. It was like the essence of one soul seeing the essence of another. It means being able to be in a situation where you're like naked in a good way. All your defense mechanisms, all your deceptions, all the games you play are gone because it's a moment of truth. We all have moments like that, but they don't last because we live in a world where we always feel we have to protect ourselves. And for good reason. There are predators, a lot of danger lurking. But to completely give up on that part and become so jaded and cynical is also a tragedy. So there was these 2 Rebbes, there's 2 children when they were one of them later became the Rebbe Rashab, and he had another brother. He had 2 brothers, but he had an older brother called Reb Zalman Aaron. So when they were children, they play like what do children play. They copy with their parents. Their father was a great Rebbe, Reb Marash. So they copied. So one of them dressed up like a Rebbe, one dressed up like a Chassid, and they would play Rebbe Chassid. So the Razah walks in to Yechida, so to speak, a private audience, his 2 kids, and his brother's all dressed up like a Rebbe, and he comes in, and he says, I'd like to ask you something. And there's many stories told about these games, but one of them that I want to share was that he says to his brother, he says, so tell me, Rebbe, what is a Jew, or what is a human being? So the Rebbe Rashab, as a kid, says, a Jew is fire. So he grabs his brother's arm, like that, and says, if you're fire, how come I don't get burnt? So his brother answers, because when fire touches fire, it doesn't get burnt. I mean, this is a little boy, but can imagine he was going to grow up to be a big Rebbe, so he had butzim bekut, butzim mekat fiyidi, you could tell. But if you think of the answer, it's an unbelievable answer. We all have 2 parts to our lives. One part of it is Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the fire in our soul. But then we encounter a world that's very not fiery, let's put it this way. No passion. It's dry, it's dead. The material world, an inanimate universe, the exact opposite of fire. And then these 2 come into contact, we know what happens. One can hurt the other. Fire can consume. And the opposite, that which is not fire, can extinguish the fire. So how do you harness and how do you access the fire of the passion of a soul in a world that doesn't respect such passion, or actually fights it even? It's not so simple. So one of the ways is, and this is what the Torah teaches, that there's fire everywhere. That's what the Kabbalists say, there are divine sparks everywhere. You're not fighting an enemy. On the outside there may be enemies, but as I said earlier, engraved in existence is the divine sparks everywhere. God put it there. There's not an evil world. It's a garden. but it's concealed. You ever see a garden where weeds grow and everything grows so you can't tell? Layers and layers and layers of dust and so on. So you meet somebody who may be on the outside very abrasive, very angry, very sinful, whatever. Everything seems to be like wrong. But if you look with eyes, with divine eyes, you're not naive. You understand this person could be dangerous too. They're criminals also. But you never, ever forget that the person has a soul. The question is, how do you get there? As I said, without naivete, obviously you have to stay away from danger. I'm not suggesting that everything is conquerable. Some things a person should not take upon themselves, certain challenges. But I'm not talking about extremes now. In the regular day activities, people get distracted. They live in a world where their fire is very deeply buried, like a pilot flame. And this is where the difference between a Freudian perspective and a Torah perspective. Freud taught that there's the id deep inside, which is narcissistic. So you can't hope for more. You cut to the core of the person, you're not going to find a gentle or sensitive person. You're going to find an animal, a wild animal only interested in its own survival at the expense of everyone. But as Freud says, a human being has a layer called the ego and the superego that are superimposed to behave, to coexist. But it's not who you really are. You're a beast. And the Torah says, as I said, if Freud spoke to Moses, he would tell him that the real essence of a person is not the id, but the yid. The why, the pintele yid. That you go deeper, behind the narcissism and behind all the selfishness and greed lies a spark. And everything in existence has a spark. We say in the Torah, Lo yalechem levada yichya adam. Not on bread alone does a human being live, but on the spark, Meitzeh pi Hashem. Everything has a spark. This is the essence of Kabbalistic Hasidic thought. So wherever you go, you have allocated sparks. They're buried everywhere. In the workplace, and when you travel in a taxi, a doctor's office, wherever you go. And God leads the footsteps of a person, Hashem Mitzad Yigavri Kanana, for you to gather those sparks. However, we're usually distracted. We're busy with our own survival. So, you're busy with your agenda. And then you sometimes lose the opportunity. So you may be going somewhere. Now, summer's coming. People go on vacation. You may think you're going to enjoy yourself, which may be the real reason in your mind. But God is leading you there because there's an opportunity for you to meet somebody, say something. And sometimes it's the unexpected, the spontaneous, is where the real purpose that you were there. But if God told you, listen, go there to find the spark, you look at your calendar, you say, I don't really have time for that. So what happens is, God convinces you, the circumstances convince you, that's a great place for vacation, maybe it's a business opportunity, nice water, nice this, nice beaches, nice parties. And meanwhile, while you're there already, the sparks are waiting for you to redeem them. So everywhere there's a spark. And that's what that Rebbe Rashab said. You touch fire with fire, two flames actually become a stronger flame. Not only don't they oppose each other, they will not melt into one. Look at when two flames come together. But if you're not going to behave like a spark, then obviously what happens is two things will contradict each other. They will consume each other, can hurt each other. So that's our choice. So we learn from this is that just as God gazed at the people as he counted each one, as I said before, each soul is valuable. Moses was one, and the simplest Jew at the time was counted as one. Nobody was more than one. Inherent value of every neshama, of every soul. So if we could apply that to our times, we don't have to necessarily go count each other. There's no census. When Mashiach comes, will be the final census. But the idea of looking at people, being able to look at people with love, being able to not be distracted by their externals. Obviously, all done with the right discretion. Sometimes you do have to deal with those externals. But not to judge and not to have anger, but to learn how to help, like Michelangelo, help redeem, help free the angel that's trapped. That's our mission. That's our mission. And the truth is, when you look at yourself that way, it's easier to look at others that way. You look at yourself with anger and fear and negativity. You loathe yourself. You're usually going to loathe other people too. When you are able to see the good inside of yourself, which is why the Rebbe said then that you have to see your own qualities. Because seeing your own qualities is not so simple. It's not just an ego trip. It's about truly seeing that you have unbelievable potential. And that makes you responsible, obviously, to live up to it. So, sitting here on my perch, and I look at all of you hopefully I could see a little what these great people taught us to see, to look with the right eye, and to see the positive potential in everyone. And above all, I wanted to tell you that, please see me as a friend. Any way I could help anyone to actualize their potential. We're all here. We all help each other. And recognize that each soul was sent to this earth with a indispensable mission that only you and only you can accomplish. Nobody else can do it but you. So you have to find people that support that believe in that, believe in you, and will help you get there. And that is what I was trained is ultimate pleasure that a person could have in this world. An ultimate mission is if we can all help each other discover that potential. So many of us, so much time of our lives, and so many of us are distracted by the sideshows, whether it's money or power or just survival. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. It's because reality, reality of life. Like people tell me, Rabbi, I don't have the time. I have to pay my bills. I have these challenges, that challenges, therapy. There's so many things that are overwhelming us. But at times you have to have a moment of truth and cut through it all and realize that maybe if you were able to access that inner part of yourself, that itself would free up a lot of time instead of focusing on all the ghosts and skeletons and all the negative. You'd have something, what are you looking forward to? What do you really want to accomplish with your life? What's your calling, your potential? And that's the ultimately goal why we count. And it says the last counting will be, the last minyan will be when Mashiach comes, the Messianic age. Because after all that we've gone through, you can imagine the pleasure that God and all of us, our ancestors, have that we made it through this, it's called the hell of life, through Golus and all the challenges. To look at a generation after the Holocaust and see the Renaissance, after all that, after 6 million people were decimated, this itself is an unbelievable type of nachas and joy. It doesn't justify what happened. So it says at the end of days, there'll be the final count, will be like the final summation and say, look what you've accomplished, each one of you. Every one of you had your struggles, you had your difficulties, but above all, you made it through. So that's our job now, is not just to survive, but to thrive. Not just to make it, but to contribute something. The saddest thing I hear when people tell me sometimes, I think I've mentioned this, someone tells me, if I end my life not worse than when I entered, I'd be happy. Basically, damage control. That I don't get hurt more than. So I said, well, he's a businessman. So I said, so basically, tell me you're in business for, let's say, 50 years. If you come out with the same amount of money as when you began, you'll be happy. So he says, in business I wouldn't be, but in personal life, yes, I would be, because it could be a lot worse. So, and he didn't mean it as a joke. He meant it really because, life can be so challenging. You just say, at least, I avoided another day of tragedy. You come away at the end of the day, no tragedy happened. That's already a great simcha, a great joy. That happens as a result of resignation that comes over years of being worn down by life. And just, based where I come from, my training is that's simply not satisfied. That's not satisfactory. Not that I'm preaching to anybody here, but you're doing yourself an injustice. You have so much more to do, to accomplish. Just because you've been hurt or you've been slapped down a few times, is that a reason that you're going to destroy and not allow your potential to really emerge? That's how we have to look at it. And so if you're going to hang around me, that's the message you're going to get. If it's too much for you, what can I tell you? So with that being said, please, as I said, see me as a friend. And I hope I could see you as a friend as well in the same way. Myself, Velvel, our team here at Meaningful Life Center. Was this class dedicated? To my father, okay. My father's yahrzeit was yesterday, 6th yahrzeit, so we'll dedicate it to my dear father, who I would not be here today. Not just physically, but also, I guess, who I am, my personality, if it were not for him. So that's a good dedication. I sent out a very personal email yesterday about it. I had a pretty overwhelming response, which I was a little surprised by. But I guess short emails work. Let's put it this way. I'm just being. It was heartfelt. So, yes, tomorrow our dear friend Philip will be giving his class. You'll communicate with him. Philip is the guy sitting with that cool tie, the shoestring tie, Philip. And if you haven't left your email address, please do so we can stay in touch. And we will be here next Wednesday. I think the following is Shavuos, right? Or am I wrong? I'm not sure. Well, we'll be communicating by email. So it's an honor to be part of your soul's journey. And look, you got to live up to your ultimate potential because the rest of us can't be complete without it. So think about that tonight and have pleasant dreams on that thought. So thank you very much, everybody.